Good morning, everybody, and Boker Tov. Welcome to Chai There with Rabbi Leah. It's great that you came back to join me today. Again, I don't know how many of you are out there because I can't see you, only you can see me, but I'm hoping there are quite a few of you. And when you see me again at Seacrest, I hope that you will let me know that you're watching so that I can make sure that I'm providing the kind of programming that you are interested in. I know we had a little bit of a glitch this past Shabbat. I want to apologize for that, although really wasn't my fault. But every once in a while, we do have some technical difficulties. Not sure what happened this past Shabbat. I understand that there was a little bit of a stumble in Friday night blessings, as well as services getting started on time on Saturday morning. I can assure you we do our best to get great programming recorded. Our Life Enrichment team does an amazing job in getting it up on the system so that it plays on time. But if there's a power outage, or if the company that provides our SVTV service, we don't, it's an in-house cable television station, but we don't run it. And so if they're having technical problems, you're not going to get the program. Sorry. And I think, although I don't know for a fact, but I think this may have had something to do with the cyclone bomb that hit the Northeast and all up the coast, up the eastern seaboard this past weekend, because I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that's where our cable TV network comes from. So I don't know that. I'm surmising. But again, I beg your indulgence and your patience. These programs are the result of a lot of blood, sweat, and tears on the part of many of us. We definitely want you to see them. We're not eager to go to the trouble of producing them and getting them up on our system and then finding out that they don't run properly. So we are as disappointed as you are, and I hope that you will indulge us with your patience. Okay, enough apologizing. So, last Saturday, last Shabbat, during Shabbat Chaverim, I promised that I was going to continue to look at this particular Torah portion from the week, Mishpatim, with you, for a variety of reasons. One of which is there is so much material in it that we couldn't possibly have handled it just in Saturday's session alone, and I didn't want to rush through it. And secondly, because I think uniquely this Torah portion represents the first big chunk of mitzvot, that the laws and rules and commandments that the Israelites are going to get. And as we know, Moses has kind of been sitting in judgment. He has finally assigned 70 other elders who are going to help him to settle some of these disputes among the people. They have just been out of Egypt now for 7 weeks. Not a lot of time. They've just received the 10 Commandments. Nobody really understands or knows what's going on with them except for Moses, and he is trying to relay as quickly as he can the content and the substance of these commandments. So even though they have agreed that they will listen and they will do them, they don't quite know yet what it is they have signed up to do. So this is one of those cases where you will always be advised to read the contract before signing. And what the Israelites did in a huge leap of faith was they signed the contract first, and now they're reading it. And so we discussed over Shabbat some of the basic categories that are going to be laid out for them first. Information about the treatment of their servants and their slaves, information about interest on loans, how to treat animals, what happens if you strike somebody that loses a servant who loses a tooth or an eye, And it talks about the seventh year as the Shemitah year, in which the land is to lie fallow, and so on and so forth. So there is just a tremendous amount of information in here, some of which impacts us greatly to this very day. Um, and in particular, those items related to compensatory damages, to punitive damages, to who is at fault for something. And we're not going to get to all of this because it would take us the rest of the year to investigate each of these. But I did find some that I think are of interest, and I'd like to share those with you today in this session of Hi There with Rabbi Leah. So here we go. And what I am doing is I am going through the verses of each verse of this particular Torah portion to see if there's any midrashic commentary from the rabbis. And so I'm going to tell you where we're going with this next. And as soon as I get to the midrash, I will be able to explain. Okay. One of the verses that we read in this particular Torah portion, which is going to become really critical to the practices of Judaism as a whole, is a verse which we hear quite frequently, and that is in chapter 22:20. You shall not mistreat a stranger, nor shall you oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And we hear this verse many, many times in the Torah. I don't know exactly how many, but probably north of a dozen times. And this is an admonition that we get frequently because God is telling us that you know what it's like to be mistreated. You know what it's like to be a stranger in a strange land. You know what it's like to be oppressed. You know what it's like to be beaten. You know what it's like to be a slave. And therefore, you shall not mistreat a stranger. And as I mentioned, we are given this injunction over and over and over again. I believe it appears at least twice in this particular Torah portion. And one of the midrashim that I thought was quite interesting on this appears in a section called the proselytes in Israel. Now, proselytes are simply those who are not Israelite. Proselyte is someone to whom you could proselytize, someone who is still not a Jew and is eligible to become a Jew. And so one of the midrashim that I read says the following. It repeats the verse, a proselyte shall thou not vex. So in the Torah it says, you shall not oppress. In this midrash, they've changed that word to vex. Now, vexing someone can be annoying them, or vexing them can be really bullying them. And I think in this case, we're talking about bullying to the point of oppressing somebody. And it says, you are not to vex him with words. So vexing someone or oppressing someone isn't only physical oppression, as the Israelites were oppressed in ancient Egypt. Oppression, vexing, bullying is also absolutely in the form of words. And so that's what the rabbis are saying here. You are not to say to this person, only yesterday you worshipped idols, and up until just now, swine's flesh was between your teeth. So what they are talking about here is a proselyte as an individual who is becoming Jewish. I mean, we didn't obviously in those days necessarily call it conversion, but talking about an individual who is on the cusp or maybe has just become a Jew. And that the act of reminding that individual that they were once not Jewish, or that they were once a person who ate pork, because it says you are not supposed to remind somebody that up until now a swine's flesh was between your teeth. That is a big no-no. So let me finish the midrash, and then I'm going to tell you how, in a modern sense, we practice this today. Because the proselyte's origin may be tainted, Scripture warns about him in a great many passages. Okay, so we have this individual who was not a Jew, and now they're becoming a Jew. And realize that when many of these midrashim were written, it was within the first couple of centuries after Christianity was taking hold. This new cultic religion called Christianity was becoming exceedingly popular. There were those who would come to, who considered themselves Christians, who would come to the rabbis and ask them questions about Judaism in possibly in expectation that they may convert to becoming Jewish. And in this particular midrash, the rabbis are warning that you are never to remind somebody of their background, because that is a way in which you will most certainly bully someone, turn them off, and turn them away. And so we are commanded that somebody who eventually becomes Jewish, somebody who in our modern parlance we may call a convert or a Jew by choice, we are never, ever supposed to remind them, and certainly not talk about them, and the fact that at one time they were not Jewish. When somebody converts to Judaism, they are considered a Jew. We don't call them a convert. In fact, I don't even like the term Jew by choice, because it indicates that because I think we're all Jews by choice. I think that whether you were born Jewish, whether you consider yourself Jewish halachically because your mother was Jewish, being Jewish, especially today, requires choosing Judaism, because we live in a secularized society in which those things which we do as Jews have to be chosen. I have to choose to observe Shabbat. I have to choose to keep kosher. I don't live in a little shtetl anymore where I can roll out of bed on a Saturday morning, or any morning for that matter, and right into the shul next door. I have to choose my Judaism. So even to call somebody who wasn't at one time Jewish a Jew by choice may be a misnomer. They are a Jew. They are not to be reminded in any way that at one time they weren't Jewish. And I think that much of this vernacular is kind of an older generation, younger generation divide. And I consider myself, by the way, part of that older generation, because I also grew up in a time when people converted to Judaism mostly out of pressure because they were marrying somebody who was Jewish. And rabbis would not do interfaith marriages. Families would not accept someone who wasn't Jewish. And in many, many cases, in most cases, it was the women who were converting. because children would not be considered Jewish if the woman was not Jewish. So right here in this Torah portion, we learn that you are not to oppress the stranger. And that oppression comes in many forms. The Israelites knew it as certainly psychological oppression, but also absolutely physical oppression due to their servitude in Egypt, but also the notion of being psychologically bullied and oppressed. And in reminding somebody that at one time in their lives they ate pig, they were swine eaters, we have oppressed them. And the quickest way to turn somebody off is to do that. So we could probably relate this to an extraordinary number of modern examples, from somebody who has done their time in prison to, offering them an opportunity for work, to begin a life anew, and so on and so forth. So that's just one example, maybe a terrible example, but nonetheless, we are to welcome the stranger. We are supposed to take care of those who are marginalized in our society. We are encouraged to help them in whatever their new role may be, and not to remind them of the tainted past, which is what a proselyte is considered to have been because they weren't a Jew. We are not to remind them of their tainted past. So it's a big no-no to talk about somebody and mention they're a convert. In fact, when somebody converted to Judaism years ago, it was customary for them to take on the Hebrew name of daughter or son of Abraham and Sarah. Because if their own parents weren't Jewish, they adopted, so to speak, Avraham and Sarah as their Jewish parents. So somebody's name might have been, Gregory, and Gregory decides to become Gershon ben Avraham and Sarah. Unfortunately, when your Hebrew name is Ben or Bat Avraham and Sarah, it's a dead giveaway in most cases, unless your parents' Hebrew names were really Abraham and Sarah. It's a dead giveaway that you are a convert to Judaism. And so nowadays, most Gerim and Girot, those men and women who are becoming Jews, choose other Hebrew names and not Abraham and Sarah. They may find, they may adopt the name of somebody they know who's Jewish, who had a significant impact on their lives. They may choose another biblical character who they found, they emulate the characteristics of that individual or something like that. So we are very, very cautious about how we refer to those who have taken on Judaism as their faith tradition, to not other them and not marginalize them from the rest of Jews. And what's interesting is that there is a notation on this particular midrash that says that you run the risk of provoking somebody by reminding them of who they used to be, to the point where they may lapse back into idolatry. So if you make it so difficult for that individual proselyte who has chosen to become a Jew by reminding them of who they used to be, that they may just go back to being an idol worshiper, at least in the biblical terms, an idol worshiper. So we have to be careful of these things, and we have to be very cautious who we call what, and the verbiage that we use to refer to those in our midst who may not have been Jewish when they were born, but are certainly Jewish now. There is a very interesting verse in chapter 22 of this Torah portion, 22:24, that says the following: When you lend money to my people, meaning you as a Jew or an Israelite, lend money to another Jew or Israelite, to the poor person who is with you, in other words, somebody who is living within your tribe, your neighborhood, your surroundings, you shall not behave toward him as a lender. You shall not impose interest upon him. Okay, so there are actually two parts to this verse. The first is that I'm going to take the second part first, and that is, you shall not impose interest upon him. So there's two parts to a loan, right? There's the chunk of the loan, and then there's the interest on the loan. And this verse tells us that you shall not impose interest upon the person that you've loaned the money to. It's an interest-free loan. So if we think about The Merchant of Venice, the Shakespeare play, the very anti-Semitic Shakespeare play, and we ask ourselves, why then was Shylock, who is Jewish, a moneylender? And the reason is that in the time of Shakespeare, and for many, many centuries, Jews were highly restricted in terms of what sort of occupations they could have. They couldn't own land, so they couldn't be farmers. They couldn't join guilds, and if you couldn't join a guild, that meant you couldn't be a goldsmith or a blacksmith or a silversmith. So the number of occupations available to Jews living during medieval times was quite limited. One of those occupations was money lending, because Christians saw that as Christians who dictated what kinds of occupations Jews could have, dictated or indicated that money lending was um, a dirty business, and therefore they didn't want to dirty their hands with it. Let's let the Jews do the money lending. And the Christians didn't want to have to charge interest to other people, and so they let the money lenders deal with that. So money lending was seen as a dirty occupation, and definitely not an occupation that was held in high esteem. Okay, so we have this verse in the Torah that says, when you lend money to my people, to the poor person who is with you, you shall not behave toward him as a lender. You shall not impose interest upon him. So number one, you can't impose interest. And number two, you shall not behave toward him as a lender. Well, what does that mean, that you cannot behave towards somebody as a lender? Well, the interpretation that the rabbis gave to it is that you cannot remind that person that they owe you money, because they're already feeling as if they are perhaps less than because they owe somebody money, but you cannot go after them for the money. And in fact, if you go to somebody's door to remind them that they owe you something, whether it's a pledge of some kind or money, you may not enter their household. If somebody borrows a book from me and I go to retrieve that book from them, I can't go into their house and look for it. and invade their space. I have to wait outside of the door, say, um, "You have my book. Please return it to me," and then wait patiently for them to do that. So that's just one example of many that I could give you about repaying somebody something that you owe them. Okay. Or something that they owe you. So here is the midrash that the rabbis happened to write on this. And I'm looking for it right now. And it said the following. And this is how far the rabbis carried this. When Rabbi Dimi came from the land of Israel, he said, "How do we know that when a man is his neighbor's creditor for a manet, and a manet is a form of currency, uh, and he knows that his neighbor does not have the money to repay it, he may not even pass in front of him?" From the verse, "Do not act toward him as a creditor," which is the verse directly from the Torah. You are not allowed to remind somebody that they owe you money. So Rabbi Dimi comes from Israel, and he is expounding on this verse from Torah with other rabbis, and he says to them, "How do we know that exactly what this verse means?" And he says, "Well, in my land, in the land of Israel, if you see somebody who owes you money, even if it's a maneh, which is must have been a small amount of currency. You know, I borrowed $1 from my friend. Okay? How do we know that you're not even supposed to pass by him? You're not even supposed to go near that person, because just by going near them, it will be a reminder to them that, oh my God, you know, I owe that guy money. I feel so bad. I don't have it. I can't pay him back. We are not supposed to make somebody feel that way. So as a result, this rabbi is saying we know it because the verse in the Torah tells us, you know, don't go there. Don't remind them that they owe you money. Don't make them feel like a debtor. Don't behave like a creditor. Don't go up to them every 5 minutes and say, "Hey, remember that $1 you owe me? You better pay it back." Because we are lending the money interest free with the expectation that A, we're not going to get the money, and B, we cannot badger the person for the loan back. So, and this all comes to play out. It's interesting that we should be in a Shemitah year, in the 7th year, because every 50th year, so 7 times 7, we go through these 7-year cycles. That's 49 years. And then in the 50th year, we have a year called the Jubilee, the Yovel. And in that year, all debts are forgiven. So that's a whole other very interesting subject that we can study. But it means that if you have loaned money to someone, that debt is now forgiven. So land returns to rightful owners without having to be paid for, and so on and so forth. So, you know, if you lend money to somebody, you either A, have to have some sort of an agreement as to what the repayment of that debt will be, or you just have to let it go and say, "I trust that that person's going to pay me back." And without being able to badger and bully them into paying you back. Sorry, folks. In the Torah, rabbis expounded on it. Take it or leave it, but I think there are some important lessons to be learned about how we treat people whom we who are in a situation in which they need to borrow money, and what our rights, responsibilities are with respect to either borrowing money or lending money. So finally, in our discussion this morning, I want to get to the verse that we read in this Torah portion about from which the many of the precepts of kashrut derive. And that is, and let me just find the specific verse, Exodus 22, verse 19, the verse that says, Lo tivashel gedi b'chalav imo, you shall not cook a kid in the milk of its mother. So we have this verse that is part of chapter 22 in this particular Torah portion that specifically says, do not take a baby goat and slaughter it, and then make a beef stroganoff or a lamb stroganoff, where you are using the milk of the mother of the goat as the sauce in which you are cooking the goat. Okay. The question is why? And the question is, how did this one verse develop into such an elaborate system of kashrut? So what we have to understand here is that there are really two major pieces to the kosher dietary laws. The first is specifically what is written in Torah and what is forbidden. And we know that when we get to the book of Leviticus, we're going to have a very long list of those foods which are verboten, which are strictly forbidden. So we learn of many categories of food that we are not allowed to eat, and those are specified in the Torah. Obviously, pork, eating pig, chazer, is not permitted. Eating anything that lives in the ocean that does not have fins and scales is forbidden. So any sort of shellfish, any crustacean is forbidden according to Torah. We are not permitted to eat those birds which are themselves carnivorous, birds of prey, vultures, eagles, and so on and so forth. They eat live animals, and they eat dead animals, and they eat the blood of dead animals, and therefore we are not permitted to eat them. We are not permitted to eat scavenger fish, those fish which feed off the bottom of the ocean and eat less desirable things, let's put it that way. There are other insects, animals that we are not permitted to eat, and those are all laid out in excruciating detail in the Torah. Now we come to this verse that says, you shall not cook a kid in the milk of its mother. What exactly does that mean? Does that mean specifically a baby goat in the milk of its own mother? Does it mean any animal in milk? What does that mean? Well, this is the system of kashrut that was developed by the rabbis. So it isn't deraita, which means from the Torah, it's derabanan, it's from the rabbis. And this is where we get into some intense discussion about just what does that verse in the Torah mean. If you take it literally, it means don't take a baby goat and make a stew out of it using the milk from that goat's own mother. That would be the very, very, very literal way of interpreting that verse. It also means don't put meat on your pizza. Don't have a burger with cheese on it. So what started out as this one verse in the Torah has become, as I said, this very elaborate system of kashrut. So keeping, uh, one aspect of keeping kosher, and one of the most important aspects of keeping kosher, is keeping meat and milk properly separated. Not only in the kitchen, not only in a refrigerator, not only in your dishes, but certainly in your body as well. And that prohibition derives from this verse. And the verse appears 3 times in the Torah. It's twice in Exodus and once in Deuteronomy. And the sages explain that the repetition of a verse, anytime we have something more than one time, it teaches us that it's not only forbidden to cook meat and milk together, but it's also forbidden to eat them together or to derive any benefit from the mixture. So I'm not sure I understand what a benefit from the mixture would be other than a tasty stew and the pleasure of eating a tasty stew. The Hebrew word gedi, which is a kid, a baby goat, is understood to mean any young domestic animal, not only a baby goat. So, in fact, the Torah forbids the cooking, eating, and benefit. There's the 3 times it's mentioned. You don't cook it, you don't eat it, and you don't benefit from it. I guess meaning that you don't serve it in your restaurant because you would be benefiting from the sale of that food. But the rabbis went on to say that you are forbidden from cooking, eating, and benefiting from any meat of any kosher domesticated animal in any kosher milk. So you can have a kosher cow that has been ritually slaughtered and is kosher. And by the way, we know that kosher meat is meat that has to be koshered properly, slaughtered in a kosher manner. I'm not going to use the word properly because I have some personal issues with what that means. But meat that has been slaughtered according to kosher law. The meat has to be a source of meat from an animal that chews its cud and has a cloven hoof. So let's say you have this kosher cow or a cow and it's been slaughtered in a kosher manner, and you now are making hamburger meat out of it. You cannot put cheese on that meat, and we all know this. I mean, we know this is kind of a basic rule, but I'm trying to give you what the genesis of the law is. The Torah simply gives an example of cooking a kid in its mother's milk because that was a common practice in ancient times. And who was it a common practice of? Well, not the Israelites, maybe initially, but it was a common practice of those cults and tribes living around the Israelites. And we know that eating, possibly more than any other activity, is a social activity that can be enjoyed by groups of people coming together. Families, friends, relatives, you name it. People living together in a senior living community. Eating is not only an activity which sustains us physically, but sustains us emotionally and spiritually and socially. So, if you are forbidden to eat those kinds of foods that the tribes around you are eating, you're probably not going to socialize with them. If a kid is growing up in an Orthodox community and a secular Jewish friend of theirs is having a birthday party and they're going to be serving pizza at that birthday party with sausage or pepperoni on it, the likelihood that that kid is going to go to that birthday party is pretty remote because there's going to be nothing there for them to eat. And so this was a way of keeping the Israelites separate from and away from, and therefore not fraternizing with these other tribes that were eating forbidden foods, at least forbidden to the Israelites. So the Torah forbids the cooking of or consumption of any milk with any meat. Now I'm talking about kosher milk, meaning from a kosher cow, or kosher meat. Several reasons have been suggested, and some argue that it's just on the face of it cruel to cook a baby animal in the milk of its mother, because that milk is there to nourish that baby and is the life force that keeps that baby alive. You know, baby animals, baby humans only drink milk. They don't eat food yet. And so if you kill the mother of that baby, or if you kill that baby and then take the life source that would have been used to nourish that baby, um, it's just offensive, highly offensive. Others suggest that the reason for this mitzvah is health related, and um, I can't speak to that. I don't know if there are um, health reasons for not wanting to eat milk and meat together. I would imagine there may be. Um, People are lactose intolerant. I honestly don't know what those might be, but there are some who say that. Now, Maimonides asserted that an ancient pagan ritual involved the cooking and consumption of milk and meat together. And that's the source of the prohibition. So we don't want to be like the pagans, so we don't do it. In any event, it's clear that the main reason for this mitzvah is really beyond our comprehension. And so it's referred to as a chok. Now, a chok is a statute, a law that we fulfill simply because it's in the Torah, even though we may not understand it. So we can try to understand it. We can make up reasons to understand it. We can surmise what the reasons might be. We can conjecture what those reasons might be, but that might not be the case. Okay. So the Torah is somewhat vague in these parameters, but the rabbis added a bunch of other prohibitions about how long you have to wait between eating meat and milk. In some communities, it's hours. In some communities, it's 45 minutes. It depends on where you're from. You can eat milk before meat, but not meat before milk. Some say it's because it takes meat longer to digest. And if you eat milk first, it digests quicker. Um, and even very young children are required to, children 6 and older in some Orthodox communities are required to wait before consuming. Children under the age of 6 are not. So, it's customary that someone who eats a dish that was cooked with meat has to wait 6 hours before they can eat dairy food. That's customary. But somebody who eats parve food that's neither milk nor meat, that was cooked in a meat pot, doesn't have to wait, even if the pot was not completely clean. So I may cook a fish dish in a pot that was a meat pot. I don't have to wait. You're not allowed to eat meat and milk products on the same tablecloth unless it was washed in between. Pieces of bread that were on the table during a meat meal shouldn't be consumed with dairy products, and vice versa. So it can become very, very complex. As you know, we try as best we can at Seacrest to not mix milk and meat and to avoid in our dining rooms anything that either looks like pork or shellfish, or certainly is pork or shellfish. So we could elaborate on this for days and days, but I'm running out of time. So I want to thank you for joining me. Don't forget, this week we have Blessings Friday night, services Saturday morning, and then another episode of Shabbat Chaverim on Saturday afternoon of this coming week. I hope you will join me for everything, And thank you for being there for Hi There with Rabbi Leah. Shalom.